So earlier this year, the game Streets of Rage 4 was released. Not by Sega, but with their blessing, made by company Dotemu, along with Lizard Cube and Guard Crush Games. Though developed by different people, it manages to retain the soul of its predecessors. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you punch your way across the city, fighting everything from the common street thug to combative robots as you make an attempt to take down a criminal syndicate. There are some gameplay changes made when compared to the last Streets of Rage, but rather than just going over those, I thought it would be more interesting to go over the gameplay of all the Streets of Rage games and see how it has changed and evolved from the first game up until now. The original Streets of Rage, developed by Sega in 1991, is by no surprise the most simplistic out of the entire series, but everything done here will define the core gameplay for the others to come. For starters, being a beat-em-up, you need methods with which you can beat people up. In this title, there are 4 different basic moves shared amongst the 3 different character choices, Adam, Axel, and Blaze. The one that will be used the most is your standard punch-kick combo, which starts with a jab, but upon connecting with an enemy can be chained out further, knocking them away upon completion. The character select screen even shows off each one to emphasize its importance and the differences between the character choices. The other 3 are a back attack, to smack foes who creep up behind you, a jump attack, which does decent damage and is the only attack that can be used while moving, making it useful to hit enemies while closing distance or avoiding their attacks, and finally a set of grapples, which are instigated by making direct contact with enemies, the resulting effect and damage of the grapple depending on the direction you input and what direction the enemy was grabbed from. And like the combos, there are minute differences between characters for each type of attack. Beyond these basic moves, there are also more advanced methods you can use. For instance, there is jab blocking. Each of the basic combo hits have hit stun, in other words, when you hit an enemy, they cannot act immediately after getting hit. So instead of completing your combo and sending them flying, you can reset it, keeping them locked in hit stun until they go down for good, though other present enemies won't wait for you to finish. You can also use this tactic in conjunction with your movement to hit an enemy and slowly move towards them during hit stun to safely grapple them. And another thing you can do, which unlike the other 2 feels very unintended by the developers, is to quickly swap directions during combos to hit both left and right with one attack, making it useful when surrounded, though you might feel bad afterwards. Once you take to the streets, you use these different attacks and techniques to deal with the goons attempting to halt your progression towards their nefarious boss. There are different types of enemies and they employ different types of attack patterns, so you need to judge on the fly who you need to target and how. Some enemies will stay in front of you, just out of reach, some will lurk far away and charge you once your back is turned, while others will aggressively rush in close or will attack you once you've entered their attack range or on a predetermined cycle. Some will even deny certain methods of engagement altogether, and enemies can be wielding weapons which further change the way they attack. You also rarely fight just one at a time. You have to find ways to deal with all these different overlapping enemies and attack patterns while avoiding as much damage as possible. You might try to corral enemies together and hit them all at the same time, or do a throwing grapple, turning your victim into a projectile. Aggressive foes should be dealt with quickly, but you can also knock them back with jump attacks, giving you some time to focus on others. Or maybe a stronger enemy is thrown into the mix, so you take out the weaker ones first, then safely do a jab lock. Any number of tactics can succeed if you know what you're doing, but maintaining your health should remain your top priority. You have limited health and lives, and taking too much damage pulls you closer and closer to a game over. So, now that we know what you can do, and we know what enemies can do, how does a typical stage play out? They start with you traveling across a different part of the city, like a beach or an alley that serves as thematic background. As you push forward, baddies will start to bleed in to block your path. These encounters aren't at all random, they are scripted to show up based on how far you've gone. So you use your skills to beat up some here and beat up some there, and eventually the screen will progress no further. At this point, you deal with waves of enemies that approach from all sides. These too are scripted, with more baddies bleeding in based not on distance, but by how much damage has been done or how many have been defeated so far, as well as adding in the ones you may have passed earlier. After blasting through the waves of enemies, the screen unlocks and you start the cycle over again. In either part, you may be introduced to new enemy types or variants of existing ones that have more health and new attack patterns that will then freely take part in future engagements. Depending on the stage, there's also the occasional environmental hazard that needs to be played around, and scattered around these stages, you can pick up some of the few things that aren't trying to kill you in breakable objects. These are things like weapons, which will increase your damage and hit range, but at the cost of attack speed, which leaves you rather vulnerable during the recovery period. or food, which gives varying amounts of health, usually dumping full heals before or after tougher segments. You can also get extra lives or bonus points, which gaining enough also grant extra lives, and on rare occasions you can get extras of your special attack, which is where an allied police cruiser is called in to bombard the area, clearing the screen of enemies, which is normally available once per life and incredibly useful if you find yourself in a tough situation. Survive long enough and you'll reach the end of the stage and be met with a boss. These bosses, much like the game at hand, are quite simplistic, most having only 1 or 2 attacks. The damage they do is massive to compensate, but being so simplistic, their moves are easily exploitable, so once you discover that weakness, they should go down easy, provided there aren't other enemies trying to throw a wrench into that plan. This gameplay will then repeat, getting harder and harder for each stage as the new and variant enemies create more intense fights, along with bosses being brought back as mini-bosses, eventually culminating in the final stage with a boss rush and the most powerful variant enemies spread out in between them, concluding with a fight against Mr. X, the leader of this criminal syndicate. Once he's defeated, the credits roll, and we move on to Streets of Rage 2. Despite releasing only about a year apart, quite a significant number of additions have been made in Streets of Rage 2, not least of which are the new characters and the expansion of combat options. In regards to the original Streets of Rage, Adam Hunter is no longer present as a playable character, but instead takes on the role of a damsel in distress to drive the plot. Replacing him are his brother Skate and the wrestler Max. The established core gameplay determined in the original remains largely unchanged, as it will throughout all the others, but the additions to combat give you more tactical choices when dealing with enemies. The 4 basic actions from Streets of Rage 1 return, but with some updates. The back attack still filling the role of smacking someone away that's crept up behind you, but can no longer be done with a weapon in hand, as it's now the input for throwing the weapon you've got, a feature absent in Streets of Rage 1. And grapples are initiated the same, but now there are more variations and character-specific variations, and the jab combos this time around have more lockout between attacking and being able to move, which affects approaching stunned enemies for grapples, and not so surprisingly, you can't swivel a hit back and forth anymore, though you can start a combo in one direction and finish it in another. But the biggest change to the original moveset has to be that jump attacks now come with 3 different versions compared to the 1 in the original. There is a neutral jump attack, activated by jumping straight up and attacking. It does the most damage, and since you don't move anywhere, it's primarily a defensive maneuver. There's also a moving jump attack. It has a longer reach, good for charging forward and knocking foes off their feet. And finally, a downward drop attack, activated by holding down and attacking during any jump. Unlike the other 2, the enemies won't get knocked back after being hit, so you can go straight into a grapple or any other attack you wish. There are also some new additions to the basic moveset. You can now hold the attack button for a few seconds and release to do a higher damage version of your combo finisher. Also, double tapping a direction and attacking will do what's known as a blitz attack. These are decent damage attacks that have some amount of range and mobility. And finally, you can no longer summon a police cruiser. Instead, each character has been given 2 different special attacks. A stationary special, which hits in a wide area around you, and a directed special, which hits in the direction you indicate and does much more damage. Unlike the limited-use police cruiser, these specials can be used whenever you want, but at the cost of a small amount of health, so there's still some strategy in choosing the best time to use one. The enemies have also seen their fair share of changes. For starters, there are now more varieties of them, and they can be split into common and uncommon types. The common ones being great in number, sporting only 1 or 2 engagement tactics, not least of which is attempting to surround you. And the uncommon variety might show up once or twice a stage. They tend to have more moves, more health, more damage, and function a lot like mini-boss fights, each with their own distinct engagement style. Also, enemies that wield weapons now wield them much more aggressively than their Streets of Rage 1 counterparts, and you'll find that they can pick them up off the ground, much like you do. And some enemies will counter specific battle tactics that you might use, such as getting uppercutted out of a jump attack, grappling you before you can grapple them, counterattacking if you stand too close while they get up off the ground, and some can guard against your various attacks. The bosses have also been significantly revamped. They are no longer the one-and-done enemies of the original. They now have a variety of attacks, they have their own grapples, it's harder and sometimes impossible to trap them in jab locks, and they counter certain moves just like regular enemies. They still have attacks that can be exploited, but with all the different moves they do, you feel less locked in to the one-win strategy. So, with all these different varieties of enemies tagged along with all the additions to the combat system, fights overall end up being much more dynamic than they were in the original game. With the common enemies, you still practice the basic tactics like corralling them together or using throwing grapples to your advantage, but newer additions like the blitz attacks can let you deal damage and immediately shift focus to others. You can use the combo finisher to quickly knock away enemies and ease your burdens. The stationary special has invincibility during its use, so you can use it to break out of attacks or counter big telegraphed moves, or take your normal jab combo and cancel it into a special or blitz attack, making it easier and safer to land either one. But perhaps more importantly than the tactics you employ is how they differ between the characters. In Streets of Rage 1, there were differences like Adam having reduced speed, Axel with a reduced jump attack range, and Blaze's main combo was a tad slower than the others, but none of these differences really affected the tactics of gameplay. Adam is slow, but enemies more often come to you. Axel has less jump hit range, but moving a little bit further forward isn't so hard, and Blaze's combo might be slower, but jab locking is arguably more powerful anyway. Streets of Rage 2's differences are a bit more pronounced, with the new and updated combat additions and how they better dictate a character's strengths and weaknesses. For instance, Axel's jump attacks are pitifully weak and his directed special leaves him exposed, but on the other hand, while his blitz attack doesn't have the same range as all the others, it's a powerful multi-hitting technique that becomes the focal point of his moveset. Whereas Max has incredibly high damage grapple attacks, but his slow movement makes them hard to initiate, and although they're high damage, his throw grapple has very little range. Also, his basic attacks are high damage, but so slow that he's more susceptible to getting surrounded and harder to jab lock with than compared to the others. Skate is much the opposite. He is the most agile character in the game, he's the only one with a dash, and succeeds well with hit-and-run tactics, utilizing his stronger long-distance blitz attack. And although his basic combo is very weak and low range, his jump attacks aren't, with his drop attack doing about the same damage as his fully completed combo. This makes him gravitate towards jump attacks more often, an option that won't work so well against jump countering enemies, making him flip-flop between different engagement types. Blaze is more the balanced option of the four, with no major upsides or downsides, though her blitz attack does require proper spacing, making it a poor candidate to use out of a combo, but her directed special is fast, high damage, and fires out in front of her, making it a better option than most. With these differences, running through the game with a new character will be a more unique experience, with the same fights having different levels of difficulty as tactics that might succeed with one character fail with others. Oh, and for the stages themselves, the basic setup is the same. You get placed in a portion of the city and start punching your way through to the other side, but now stages feel a bit more natural as they now transition from one backdrop to another instead of being one long area. And this also lets the stage layout change in the middle of a level without feeling odd. Enemies still spawn in the same way as the first game, via distance and damage, and the cycle of moving forward then running into screen-locked wave fights remains as well. Pickups remain completely unchanged, though certain weapons and pickups have been removed, and a subtle change is the fact that a small amount of health is regained after certain checkpoints, beyond just the use of health pickups, which I imagine is less an attempt to make the game easier and more as incentive to use your self-damaging specials. These stages get progressively difficult with new enemies and variants being added and mixed together. This goes for both the common and uncommon variety, the endgame eventually culminating the same as well, but now there's a mini-boss rush in one stage and a boss rush in the finale stage after it, finishing not with one final boss, but two back-to-back, Mr. X and his right-hand man Shiva. After defeating them, Adam is freed from capture, and it's happy endings for all. But then the crime syndicate returns unexpectedly in Streets of Rage 3. Now for some context here, I won't be using footage from Streets of Rage 3 in this segment. Instead, I'll be using footage from the Japanese version, Bare Knuckle 3. The Western releases had some, shall we say, questionable balance changes made to them, to the point that I'd wonder how intentional these changes were, but don't worry, these are difficulty alterations at most, and don't have an effect on the underlying combat systems. Now, if there's one thing you're going to notice moving off of Streets of Rage 2 to this game, it's going to be the significant increase in speed. The enemies move faster, you move faster, attacks are faster, and every character now has a dash like Skate, as well as new vertical dodge rolls. The slow hulking Max, having no place in this faster world, has been replaced by the cyborg Dr. Zahn. As far as the basic moveset goes, there aren't any new additions like there were in the transition from Streets of Rage 1 to Streets of Rage 2, just alterations to a few things. As for the main four, the back attack is the same, the grapples are also the same, the basic combos are the same, though the lockout to move after hitting has been reverted to how it was in Streets of Rage 1, and you can now complete your combo without hitting any enemies. I personally haven't found a use for that, but the option's there, I suppose. And jump attacks are the same as before, but now you have air control during moving jump attacks, making them less committal, both that and the movement lockout changes likely being centered around the underlying speed changes. The combo finisher is back, albeit a little weaker, and now only hold activated if you want it to be, as it has its own button now. One of the bigger alterations is to the special attacks, not to the attacks themselves. The only difference there is Skate's drill kick is now a flurry of punches. The alteration I'm referring to is the strength meter. These specials still drain your health on use, but the amount of damage you take is now related to a rapidly regenerating meter next to your HP bar. It drains after every special use, but if it's completely filled when you use a special, you get to use one with no consequence whatsoever. This change effectively turns special usage into a common tactic and not just a situational one. And the other big alteration to your moveset is what's been done to blitz attacks. Initially, they're the same as their Streets of Rage 2 counterparts, but they now evolve as you play. Collect 40,000 points without dying, and you'll earn a star point. Getting a star point changes the way your blitz attacks function. It's a little different for each character, but generally the first point increases the distance it travels, the second point changes it into a different, stronger version, and the third and final point adds a finisher. One of these star points is lost on every death, so self-preservation is now more important than ever, though even if you lack in star points, it's still technically possible to use these moves. They just require a secret button input. But don't think that removes the benefits of having star points. Trying to enter an input code while bashing through enemies is about as difficult as it sounds, and the more powerful the blitz attack, the more button presses are needed for the code, so consider this more of a niche option. And while there are no new additions to the basic moveset, there are some new additions to weapons, with each character having a unique attack with certain ones, like an upward sword slice with Axel, or a knife dive with Skate, and Zahn turning every weapon into a laser bowling ball. Weapons also have health bars now, likely in part to this change. Moving on to the enemies, like I mentioned, everyone is a little bit faster and more aggressive, with some of the new enemies rushing in for disruptive grapples or long-range jump attacks, and blocking is now more common and more effective than in Streets of Rage 2, putting grapples in the forefront for certain engagements. Also, the line between common and uncommon enemies has been blurred to the point of non-existence, with almost no fights having a mini-boss feel to them. And the actual bosses, much like everyone else, are a bit faster, but otherwise are the same level of complexity as those in Streets of Rage 2. Now the tactics in this game, because of the increase in speed, minor changes to damage, and the alterations to the blitz and special attack have put certain engagement methods into the forefront. The special attack changes, for instance, put your main source of damage into doing a directed special out of a combo, and it's also not uncommon to use the increased speed to close in for a quick grapple, and the blitz attack changes, especially when dealing with large number of enemies, has you charging one side of the screen with a powerful upgraded blitz attack, knocking everyone back, and switching directions and repeating. Now there isn't anything inherently wrong with these tactics, it's just that these are the tactics of every character. Streets of Rage 2 had made enough divisions between the character options that each one plays a little differently. Skate had his speed and jump attacks as strong as his combos, but now everyone's fast and his jump attacks aren't even that powerful. Axel had a powerful blitz attack that was held back by its range, but with the upgraded renditions, everyone has a strong long-range blitz attack, him included. Max used to be the one with the highest damage, neutered by his slow speed and slow hits, but now everyone's damage is much more similar, and even though his replacement Dr. Zahn is the slowest, you'd never be able to tell. And Blaze is still just Blaze, balanced with no dramatic ups or downs, but that balance was supposed to be her identity. The changes make it harder to tell. Now, I'm not saying there aren't any differences between characters. The way blitz attacks hit are different for everyone, the damage and variations of grapples too. It's just the differences like that matter less when you're still pushing for the same strategy, which is a bit of a shame seeing as how it livened up the replayability. Streets of Rage 3 does have its own attempts at that though, one being a few secret characters, these being Rue, Shiva, and in the Japanese version, Ash. They can be obtained by holding the correct buttons after fights, or playing the correct way during certain battles. Their battle tactics tend to be a bit different than the main characters, but mostly because none of them have a complete moveset. Rue is the closest to a complete one, but is still missing the evolving blitz attacks. And the other attempt at replayability comes in the form of multiple endings. Before we hit that point though, I'll go over the earlier levels. The stage setup goes the way you'd expect, themed backdrops, the same enemy spawning, variants and screen lockout rotation, and it all gets more difficult as you progress in stages as enemies get faster and more aggressive than they already are with the base changes. Throughout all the stages, you'll find pickups remain completely the same as in Streets of Rage 2, but non-boss enemies can now steal food off the ground, which makes leaving it alone until you need healing more of a gamble, and checkpoint healing is still around, but a little more sparse, not that it's needed much as incentive anymore, and a more pronounced addition this time around is stage hazards. Bikers, conveyor belts, and voids in the stage return from older titles, but now there's falling barrels and jump-altering wind in one stage, electrical floors and damage over time if you tarry too long in another, and an entire stage dedicated to a killer train car, among others. You'll also find more one-off ideas in stages, like an escape sequence with a bulldozer, alternate paths in a ninja hideout, and one stage in particular is much different than all the others. This is the one with the damage over time and electrical floors. Unlike the battle progression stages, in this one you're tasked with saving a hostage trapped behind 2 laser barriers. So you navigate different floors using an elevator and try to find the correct rooms with control panels in them, fighting preset enemies along the way. The outcome of this stage matters a lot. If you rescue the hostage, you move on to the true final stage of the game, where you once again battle Syndicate leader Mr. X, albeit in robot form. During the fight, there is a timer ticking down in the background. If you defeat him in time, his evil plot is stopped, and he is truly defeated once and for all. Should you fail to defeat him in time, you get a less than desirable ending that renders the entire game pointless. But if in the prior stage, should you fail to rescue the hostage, you get a different final stage altogether, where you mitigate Mr. X's criminal deception, but don't fight him directly, which I guess would be more of a neutral ending. These different endings and the goal of getting to the true good ending give more incentive to play through the game multiple times. I should also point out here that there are some story differences between the Japanese and Western versions, but for all intents and purposes, the Japanese version is considered the true version. Why? Because that's where Streets of Rage 4 continues off from. Now there's about a 26-year gap between Streets of Rage 3 and Streets of Rage 4, and the new developers had to try and update the series to feel more modern, while simultaneously keeping with the original design. This involved very little changes to the now established moveset, with the new additions amounting to the charged combo finisher being rebranded as a strong attack with different moves but serving the same purpose, a new aerial follow-up to drop attacks, new aerial specials, and that specials no longer have a freebie. Instead, all specials cost health every time once again, but that health is recoverable, regenning by hitting enemies, but being lost if you get hit, effectively turning them into a risk-reward combat option, having their usefulness only limited by how well you think you can play. But what's truly been done to enhance the gameplay experience comes down to the new flow of combat. One of the first things you'll notice is that the speed of your characters has been set back to feel more like Streets of Rage 1 or 2's speed, with slower, more methodical movement instead of the speedy sprinting and rolling style of Streets of Rage 3, with the evolving blitz attacks being set back as well. Yet despite this, you'll find the game moves ahead at a rather brisk pace. This shift is the culmination of a few different things, but rides on the back of 2 in particular. Changes to something that's been hiding in the background of every other game. I'm talking about the knockback mechanic. So normally when you complete certain attacks, like a combo or a jump attack or a special, if they aren't defeated, enemies are launched away, flying through the air before slamming on the ground, where they proceed to get back up, completely immune to damage for the entire duration. In Streets of Rage 4, this is no longer so. Enemies are now vulnerable to attacks for that duration. This is also synergistically combined with the other change. When the screen locks, like it does on many occasions, enemies that are knocked back would fly off screen to a place where you couldn't reach. But now, and this goes for walls and other objects as well, enemies will instead bounce off them, taking a bit of damage and flying back in the other direction, provided they were launched high or hard enough. These two changes turn a knockback into further combat opportunities, whereas in the earlier games, it could be seen as a limitation on the amount of damage you could do at once. So now you can chain attacks together and do damage that would otherwise be impossible. Use a throw grapple towards a wall and follow up with a jab combo. Use a jump attack and chain it into one of the new aerial specials. Or do something simple and chain a blitz attack into another blitz attack. And even if they don't get bounced off an opposing wall, sometimes just remaining in place while airborne provides its own combo options. These chains of attacks don't necessarily need to start with you launching someone into the air either. You'll find that chaining your normal moves is easier as well. In the earlier titles, the best you could do was go from a jab combo to a blitz or special attack, but now you can chain from charged finishers, back attacks, and even blitz attacks into other moves. Axel, for instance, can pull off a huge damaging chain of attacks where he goes from a jab combo and cancels that into a blitz attack, then cancels that into a directed special, which can then be cancelled into one of the new super attacks, which are kind of like a cross between the special attacks and the police cruiser from Streets of Rage 1. and then as your target falls back to the ground, start up another chain. This is what changes the flow so drastically. What was once a game about simple combos and grapples is now about banking enemies off walls, juggling them in the air, and weaving different combinations of attacks together in one fluid motion, allowing you to defeat enemies faster and flashier than ever before. This is perfectly represented by the new combo scoring system that tracks the number of hits and the amount of damage you output, giving you a score bonus based on how well you did, and concludes if you don't attack within a certain length of time, further pushing you to keep up the speed and aggression to rack up more and more points. The other benefit here is this new flow and the tactics there within won't necessarily work the same on different characters. In Streets of Rage 3, characters had different moves but similar tactics, and in Streets of Rage 2, characters were different enough that tactics could shift depending on your character choice. Now, not only are characters different enough from each other to encourage different tactics, but even using the same ones will still be different because of the distance and direction enemies are launched or how different moves react to them being airborne. To fabricate the differences between characters, the character design reflects back towards Streets of Rage 2. You'll find that Skate and Dr. Zahn have been retired for characters Cherry and Floyd respectively. Cherry being Skate's niece, Adam's daughter. She is the speed-type character, much like Skate, being the only one with a dash, an affinity for aerial moves, and has an aerial grapple. She is also the only one who retains the air control from Streets of Rage 3, and her pogo drop attack functions differently. Instead of planting you on the ground, she launches back into the air. A lot of her combos also take advantage of her high launch distance and the fact that she can slam enemies into the ground so hard they bounce back into the air. Floyd, on the other hand, is the protege of Dr. Zahn, but his large stature and slow movement make him more relatable to the hulking Max. And like him, has high damage hits and grapples. Unlike him, however, is the ability to do a dual grapple attack, to do a grapple special, and his directed special, instead of doing damage, is a ranged grapple initiator to help compensate for his low speed. It also works into his combos, as you can pull people straight out of the air. Axel and Blaze return with fairly identical movesets to their prior selves, but you'll find that Axel has slow recovery time and poor launch distance on most of his specials and his blitz attack, making them good to combo into, but not so much out of. And Blaze, while lacking the damage of Axel and Floyd and the launch power of Cherry, has the capability to weave her moves more freely into each other, more so than any other character. She also has the smallest damage penalty on her specials, making them all that more appealing. Proceed far enough in the game, and you'll also unlock Adam, finally off the sidelines. Technically, he's still a slow and powerful character like his Streets of Rage 1 iteration, but has the addition of a short-range hop for closing distance, separating his identity from characters like Floyd and Axel. You'll also find his attacks are very straightforward, both in terms of simplicity and how he launches his foes, focusing on blasting enemies off walls and then sending them right back. These nuances between characters will liven up each playthrough of the game, not only as you play each one differently, but the way they launch the enemies and how they affect them in the air or on the ground creates a deeper level of mastery, more so than any other Streets of Rage. Of course, the choice of tactics in fights is not just left up to your characters, but also to the enemies involved. This game features the largest enemy population out of all of them, pulling both enemies from across all prior games, as well as making new ones, which is impressive in and of itself, but within that, there is also the largest number of variant enemies, some of which have attack patterns so different they could be counted as unique enemies and not just variants. This game also brings back Streets of Rage 2's concept of common and uncommon enemy types, so expect more mini-boss style engagements. Now, like each game, more enemies means more new attack patterns and thus more complex fights. You won't ever be fighting all of them at once, but some fights can get pretty messy. So to temper down some of that complexity, the more unique enemy attacks come with a tell, a smidgen of information that an attack is on its way. For some, this might be taking on a certain stance or moving in a certain location. For example, these biker ladies have a big wind-up before they charge forward, or the shielded riot policemen raise their nightsticks before they strike, and enemies with grapples will flash red to indicate their intent, and enemies who flash white gain super armor, in other words hit stun immunity, which blocks your ability to cancel their attacks. These tells go for bosses as well, often with different ones for different attacks, and this puts dodging and then counterattacking as the primary method of dealing with them. Not that it makes them easy. Aside from the different ways you need to dodge different attacks, bosses also come with different battle phases now. After dealing a certain amount of damage, their attacks will be empowered, or they'll get new attacks altogether, or normal enemies will be bled into the fight, or perhaps a combination of the three. Some other factors in battle that need to be considered are an enemy's weight. Bigger enemies, generally the uncommon enemies, are so heavy that they are launched a shorter distance and grappled much slower than the lighter weight ones. You should also worry about multiple enemies juggling you in the air, which if you thought the knockback changes only applied to enemies, you'd be wrong. Counters also make a return. They are also more consistent, which is something I would attribute to the new engine and not as a balance change. There are also breakout attacks, which are done the second a nearby enemy leaves hit stun, punishing you for ignoring them and putting an end to jab blocks. And some enemies can also counter thrown weapons by catching them or blocking them outright. And while we're on the topic, there aren't weapon specials anymore. Instead, each character's basic attacks with weapons are different. Different speeds, different ranges. Some can do empowered attacks, but these are just stronger versions of the normal attack, and not unique like the specials. Also, the developers have blessed us with a dedicated item pickup and throw button instead of utilizing the attack button, which if you ever played the older games and been held hostage by a dropped weapon or a floor chicken, you can see why this was needed. The stages continue to follow the same formula as they have up until now. We also keep Streets of Rage 3's abundance of stage hazards, but lack the one-off stage design and multiple endings. Instead, however, we get the longest game in the series, which has also been paired with a save and load story mode for that increased length. Not that the arcade style isn't included as well, just it would be harder to do something that long in one sitting. In terms of replayability, beyond just the character difference, each stage and mode comes with its own graded ranking system, a more modern take on the old scoring system, with the higher S ranks needing you to utilize the combo system as best you can. The numerical score you earn also serves a second function. The amount across all different modes is tracked, and after crossing certain thresholds, new characters are unlocked for play. Well, I say new, but in reality, it's just all the mainline characters from previous games with the same appearances and mostly the same movesets, just rebalanced to fit the current iteration. Speaking of throwbacks, within certain levels you can find old arcade cabinets. Strike it with one of the new taser weapons and you'll get a chance to fight an older boss, though only bosses from Streets of Rage 2. Which at this point, between these secret fights and the changes to the characters and their movement and the pullback to uncommon enemy types, I think it's clear which game the developers valued most when creating this one. But even with that in mind, the bits they've pulled from all the games ultimately turn this into what I think is the best playing Streets of Rage yet. The new flow of combat gives a faster, more fluid fighting system that will take more to master than the older ones. The stage layout has been refined to create more interesting arenas around more distinct stage hazards, and the enemies and bosses are in great number with an abundance of attack patterns that reward understanding how each one works and how best to dispatch them. And without building upon the pre-established ideas of the others, it would have never reached this point, like with the base gameplay defined in Streets of Rage 1, the defining character difference and moveset additions in Streets of Rage 2, the more hazard-centric stages and the mainstream special usage developed in Streets of Rage 3. Without all of these, Streets of Rage 4 would never be the game it is, and it's certainly interesting to see how the games have changed and evolved to reach this point. And it would certainly be interesting to see where it could go from here.